Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Bedlam the Game by Christopher Brookmyre for PC, Mac, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Red Bedlam and published by Kiss Limited that was released in October of 2015 for PC and Mac, and it later saw release on Xbox One and PS4 as well. And it's based on the novel by Christopher Brookmyre, so it is a bit of an oddity in that we don't really get a whole lot of specifically novel-based video games. And we certainly don't get many that kind of take us through the history of FPSs, so to speak. So if nothing else, it ends up being a pretty interesting concept, but the real question here is, how is the execution? Does this thing actually work out as an FPS? Does it really make things interesting while taking us through these different eras? Or is it something else entirely? Well, as far as presentation goes, it starts off being something that fits in pretty well with the theme, where you've gone back to effectively a Quake 2 era game. So it looks like it was rendered with a software renderer, it's very low-res textures, everything's pretty blocky, the animations are kind of clunky, and nothing is particularly well detailed. But then you move on into the other games that it tries to showcase. One of them is a World War II shooter where pretty much everything is brown and gray. And it's pretty much on the same kind of graphical fidelity as what you saw in the previous game that gets showcased. The difference being that the models are slightly more detailed and the texture work is slightly better. That's pretty much it. Then you move on to the other games, and it's pretty much the exact same fidelity as the World War II game that they showcase, only with different visual themes. Now the thing is, they do pretty much nail the aesthetic that they're going for, it's just that the visuals themselves end up kind of tiring you out after a while simply because they are trying to go for that faux retro look, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. In the case of the really early FPS that you start out with, it fits in pretty well, and when you go on into the rather old school arcade games that they're kind of poking fun at, then it's definitely fitting there. But particularly when you get to the bits that are in the World War II shooter as well as the medieval fantasy game, you end up having these environments that really don't have a whole lot of charm to them. In fact, they're pretty boring to go through. It also doesn't really help that every single one of your weapons just kind of floats in front of your screen. You don't have any hand models to deal with, so it just kind of jiggles around on the screen whenever you're shooting or reloading or whatever it may well be. And while the game does have some slightly more modern effects like the lighting, it really doesn't have all that much going for it in terms of visual quality. Again, this is intentional, however. So in this particular case, it's pretty easy to let that slide. What's less easy to let slide is the fact that the gore system isn't particularly satisfying because it's basically just slight polygon shifts and you get a few particles going around that are supposed to be blood. Which of course fits in fairly well with the Quake 2 style FPS, but when you get further on into the game and it's still doing that sort of thing, it just kind of gets tiring. Then you move over into sound design, and that's where things get a bit messier. The soundtrack is alright, it's nothing to write home about. In fact, I've pretty much forgotten every single track in the game just because they were completely forgettable. But generally speaking, they do fit in pretty well with the action that's going on and the theme of the particular games that are being showcased, so it works out okay in the long run. But then you move over into the sound effects and the voice acting, and the sound effects are what I would describe as pretty much bog standard. Pretty much none of the weapons actually sound all that powerful, and the sound effects themselves just aren't very high quality either, so it ends up being a bit of a mess. But really, it's the voice acting that's the most problematic in terms of presentation, because the characters themselves are pretty much voiced by total amateurs, and it shows. I mean, that's not to say it's terrible, it's just that it really doesn't do a lot to get you immersed because, again, it's pretty amateurish. And the protagonist herself, while the actress does a decent enough job delivering the lines, ends up saying a lot of stuff that's just really cringy. And on top of that, she has a certain kind of Scottish accent. The kind that when you're saying something really cringy, it ends up being like nails on a chalkboard.
I'm outside the map. I am the human wall hack. Like I said, if there's a way in, there must be a way out. Stirling, here I come. I'll never moan about the weather again.
So most of the time I just found her to be incredibly annoying, but of course your mileage may vary on that. And when you bring all that together, you find that the presentation is a very mixed bag to the point where it actually kind of interferes with your immersion. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as Heather Quinn, also known as Athena, while she's in-game, and she starts off having her brain scanned in some experimental new scanner, and finds that once the scan is complete, she has woken up in a first-person shooter from the mid 90s. And from there, the idea is that you work your way through video game areas from basically 3 decades worth of gaming in order to find your way out of the virtual world and back into the real one. And it gets more complicated than that when you run into things like the integrity and the corruption, which I don't really want to spoil for you, so I'm not really going to do much more than tease that here. But suffice to say, the story starts out as something fairly weak and ends up getting a bit stronger as you go through, only to end up being something that doesn't really resolve all that well. After the final boss fight, you end up with a cliffhanger ending, because of course you've got to have a cliffhanger ending, and it's not really something that's all that satisfying. The game doesn't really earn its cliffhanger ending. To get a cliffhanger to work properly, you have to have a lot of story threads left unresolved that are actually interesting. The problem is they don't really develop anything enough for it to be legitimately interesting other than the basic concept of why you're even there in the first place. And the cliffhanger ending ends up being something where you basically just don't resolve the plot in any real meaningful way, and thus you're just left with, well, now what? I get the idea that it's supposed to give you that sense of, well, what happens next, and maybe I should wait for the sequel or wait for the next novel or whatever it may well be, but what it really ends up doing is just making you feel like you went through all of that for pretty much nothing. The thing is, the game is only about 4 hours long at most. I beat it in 3.7 hours according to Steam, and I'm sure I could have beaten it quicker than that if I hadn't kept falling off platforms. And bear in mind, that was on the hard mode, so it's not like the game goes on for long enough to see a lot of the plot threads develop particularly strongly, and when you finally get to the end, you just go, wait, that's it? Really? That was underwhelming. And that's the general experience you get with Bedlam. It starts off as a really cool idea where you go through these different eras of first-person shooter, or really gaming in general, because it doesn't exclusively go through first-person shooters. You interact with it in the way that you would a first-person shooter, but one of the levels you go through, for example, is an RTS. And quite frankly, the one that I found the most interesting was the one where you actually go through a Pac-Man clone. And that's primarily because that explores the idea of taking you from one particular genre to the next and seeing how you interact with something when you're not from that genre. But that whole level where you're going through basically just 80s arcade game clones is really short. In fact, it's too short, because after that you go back into your standard first-person shooter stuff that you were doing before. It makes the rest of the game feel like completely unfulfilled potential, especially considering that when you really get down to it, all of the games in this play pretty much exactly the same. The only real difference you have between, say, the Quake-style first-person shooter and the World War II shooter and the eventual real-time strategy level is basically just aesthetics. Otherwise, mechanically, it's pretty much exactly the same across the board. It's just that when you get to the World War II level, you get a bunch of enemies with hit scan, and all of the weapons that are in that level are hit scan. You're still dealing with the exact same core mechanics throughout the game, which is run around and shoot stuff, and occasionally you'll have to do some jumping. And none of it is particularly satisfying. I mean, first-person jumping puzzles have never been enjoyable to begin with, so they're not really welcome here either. And when you get to the shooting mechanics, everything feels floaty and imprecise, and on top of that, the damage modeling is wildly inconsistent. Sometimes you'll shoot a guy once with the basic pistol and he'll blow apart. Sometimes you'll shoot him about 4 or 5 times with that pistol before he'll finally go down. It's just a crapshoot. In fact, I noticed with the sniper rifle that you get in the World War II level, there's really no rhyme or reason to the weapon's accuracy. You're just gonna have to be lucky if you're gonna hit something. And even when you do hit something, there's no guarantee that it's gonna be a truly damaging hit. Sometimes it does barely any damage, sometimes it just blows their head off or something. It just depends. And while it is fairly amusing to shoot skeleton warriors running around with swords and shields with your ray gun, or shoot Nazis in the face with a flame sword, it's ultimately a very unsatisfying first-person shooter simply because, again, the damage modeling is wildly inconsistent, and on top of that, it's too easy. Way too easy. Really, the only ways I died to enemies in this game were when it was due to splash damage or the stealth enemies that will hit you with sniper rifle fire. Other than that, almost all of my deaths in this game were due to me just falling off of platforms because I mistimed a jump. The enemy AI is just incredibly brain dead. They just basically walk towards you and shoot, and they don't really do anything else. They don't really seek cover very well. They don't try to work as a unit, they just walk towards you and shoot. You really don't have to vary your tactics that much at all, other than, for example, oh hey, there's a group of enemies, let me hit them with a grenade instead of just shooting each one individually with a pistol. And even then, there's no real guarantee that the grenade's gonna work either. It sometimes blows them all to hell, and sometimes it only blows 2 of them to hell, and the rest of them just keep shambling towards you. It's that inconsistency combined with the just general ease of movement and the brain-dead AI that makes the combat just feel incredibly dull. Not to mention the inventory system itself is fairly clunky because you have general categories of weapons. For example, you can press the 2 key and that'll cycle between your available pistols, or you can hit the 3 key and it'll cycle through your available shotguns and things like that. The problem is that at the end of the game you have a lot of different weapons which take up a lot of different slots, so you're going to need to constantly be cycling through them to use the ones you actually want to use. Well, if you have ammo for it anyway. You're going to have to find ammo pickups scattered throughout the levels. Some of them are hidden, some of them aren't. And you're going to also have to find armor and health pickups. So this doesn't play like a modern FPS. You don't have regenerating health of any kind. Instead, you have to rely on health packs, which are pretty plentiful for the most part, and so you'll probably never really run out of health. And you also have to rely on armor, which reduces incoming damage to a ludicrous degree. In fact, it's to the point where you basically don't even take damage at all until your armor depletes entirely, then you start taking health damage. But like the health packs, the armor pickups are pretty plentiful as well. They're not anywhere near as plentiful as the health packs, but they are still fairly common, so most of the time you're going to be having armor available to you. This all contributes to a feeling of the game just being incredibly dull, because, let's face it, if there's not much challenge in a game, then there's not really much reason to play it. Games that are too easy are just boring, and that is precisely what happens in Bedlam's case. It's a good thing that it is so short because it ends up not really wearing out its welcome, and you can kind of put up with the boredom factor as long as you play it in short bursts. But even if you're doing that, it is only about 3.5 to 4 hours long, and there's only the single-player campaign. There's no co-op or multiplayer of any kind, so really all you've got is the story. And the story itself is just kinda weak in general. Which wouldn't really be much of a problem if it weren't for the fact that the gameplay doesn't compensate for that. It's just not good gameplay either. And what you end up with here is a rather subpar shooter that has a very interesting concept, and aesthetically they pretty much nailed at least the earlier aspects of it, and it does occasionally shine with some cool ideas here and there, which of course makes me wonder how the novel is. Maybe the novel's more interesting than the game, but the game itself just isn't very good. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.